The Hittite Empire was one of the great powers of the Bronze Age. Renowned for their warrior culture and military might, the Hatti conducted countless campaigns across the ancient world, from the conquest of the great Mitanni kingdom to the sack of Babylon and even the war against the new kingdom of Egypt. However, to their west, across the Aegean Sea, laid another Bronze Age power that was for the most part of their history hostile to the great kings of Hatti. In this video, we will examine the relations between the Hittite Empire and the Mycenaean Greece and analyze why the Hittite rulers never attempted a military campaign against the Greek mainland. In the first half of the second millennium BCE, the Hittite kingdom rose to prominence in Central Asia Minor, becoming a great power of the Bronze Age that rivaled the kingdoms of Egypt, Babylon, Mitanni, and later Assyria for the political and military supremacy of the Near East. Well-established powers such as Yamhad and Mitanni would eventually fall victim to the Hittite expansion, and at one point, even the great city of Babylon itself was sacked by the Hatti. To their west, the Hittites bordered a number of smaller Anatolian kingdoms, many of which would be frequent vassals or tribunaries to the Hittite rulers. These kingdoms mostly served as buffer states between the Hatti and their true rivals to the west, the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans, based on the mainland Greece, dominated the Aegean Sea after having conquered the Minoan civilization of Crete during the 15th century BCE. Known to the Hittites as Ahhiyawa, the Achaeans established a foothold in Asia Minor, as the city of Miletus served as the main base of the Mycenaean operations to their east, mainly focusing on countering the Hittite power through continuous proxy wars. As the result of these policies, as well as the continuous hostilities between the two powers, neither Hittites nor Achaeans were able to achieve the complete dominance of the western Anatolia. As we know, the Hittites were universally recognized as great power throughout the Bronze Age, having been considered as equals by the Egyptian pharaohs and the great kings of Babylon. The Mycenaeans, however, were far removed from projecting power in Near East and did not constitute a relevant political player, at least from an Egyptian or a Babylonian perspective. To the Hittites, however, the Mycenaeans presented a significant rival, the one that constantly stood in the way of the Hatti rulers that prevented their domination to the west. In such circumstances, we wonder if the Hittites ever considered the conquest of the Mycenaean Greece, and if so, would have such feat even been possible for the Hittite kings to achieve? From the geopolitical standpoint, the Hittites, although a great power themselves, were in a very complicated situation, basically having to project their power and also protect their interests on two different fronts. To their east, they faced powers such as Assyria, Mitanni, Babylon, and Egypt, all of which on a quest to further their own influence at the expense of others. Such situation never allowed the Hittites to fully focus westwards, making it very difficult to deal with the Mycenaeans with their full might, without compromising their eastern borders. To the contrary, the Achaeans were able to allocate much of their resources for the Anatolian campaigns, as their fairly isolated geographic position meant that there was no other significant power to worry about. The Mycenaeans, although not militarily or politically involved in the Near Eastern affairs, did have trade relations with Egypt, Levant, and Assyria, and thus were very familiar with the relations and rivalries between the Eastern powers. In a case of an open conflict with the Hittites, the Achaeans would have almost certainly be able to count on at least political support from some of the Eastern powers that would be looking to capitalize on the Hittite weakness. Militarily, the Mycenaeans were a warrior society themselves, equally powerful on both sea and land. The Achaean fleet dominated much of the Aegean Sea, with their naval campaigns reaching as far as Cyprus, an island that the Hittites considered to be in their sphere of influence. Considering that the Hittites themselves were not a naval power, any sea expedition into the Aegean would have not been possible. On land, the Mycenaeans, consisting of a network of palatial centers, were arguably able to muster enough forces to stand against any great power of their time. At the Battle of Kadesh, fought in 1275 BCE between the Hittites and Egypt, both sides were reported to have had several thousands of chariots, plus tens of thousands of infantry soldiers. The Linear B records of the Mycenaeans reveal that the palace centers such as Knossos and Pylos each had several hundred chariots at their disposal. If we consider that both Knossos and Pylos were secondary to Mycenae, as well as the existence of other significant centers such as Tiryns, Thebes and Miletus, plus a few minor ones in Boeotia and Iolis, it is very possible that the Mycenaeans did have the numbers to at least challenge the great powers of their time. After all, Hittites and Mycenaeans did have history of direct military conflict, although it was usually limited to individual battles that quickly turned into proxies fought by their clients. When the Mycenaeans directly intervened in Zepasla and deposed the Hittite-installed ruler, the haughty force returned under General Kisnapili and engaged in a direct battle against the Mycenaean army. The Mycenaeans eventually retreated, but soon afterwards triggered a proxy war in Lycia, causing destruction of the Hittite army that attempted to intervene and death of General Kisnapili. Little more than a century later, the two sides went to war in the region of Troy, as both Hittites and Achaeans attempted to install their own client on the Trojan throne. Much like in the previous case, the hostilities soon ceased as the Mycenaeans agreed to leave the area, turning it into an indirect proxy war that would last for decades and would eventually serve as the historical background of the legendary Trojan War. Although the Eastern powers generally did not regard Mycenaeans as relevant to their affairs, the Hittites obviously did, and thus the king of Achaea was in the Hittite documents listed as one of the four great kings that were of equal power to the king of Hatti. Predictably, the other three were the rulers of Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. In the official correspondence between the two kings, the Hittite rulers typically referred to their Achaean counterparts, using phrases such as "my brother," "my peer," and "my equal." Although strategic rivals, Hittite and Achaean kings often needed each other in order to resolve the imminent problems, especially concerning the buffer kingdoms that stood in between. The lands of Hapala, Zipasla, and Pitasa were traditionally firm Hittite clients. Kingdoms of Seha and Mira floated between the Hittite vassalage and fight for independence, typically sponsored or aided by the Mycenaeans. The land of Caria was considered to have been in the Achaean sphere of influence, projected from the nearby Mycenaean colony at Miletus. The kingdom of Arzawa was a firm Mycenaean ally and a sworn enemy to the Hittites, always eager to engage in the anti-Hatti activities. the territory of Troy to the north, called Vilusa by the Hittites, as well as the land of Lukia to the south, were usually the contested areas where both Achaeans and Hittites looked to prevail at the expense of one another. In such circumstances, where both powers had their own clients and allies in the buffer zone, any war between the Hittites and Mycenaeans would inevitably involve a great number of nearby kingdoms, likely turning into a prolonged conflict, too costly and too devastating for each side. Therefore, both sides kept their rivalry at the level of indirect warfare, having local kings and warlords do the work for them, an everlasting status quo that existed until the very end of the Bronze Age. Special thanks to History with Sai, Nico, Chris Ernst, Panayotis Yiannopoulos, Fred Leckie, ABC Sheikh, Derek Wildstar, Vineyard Illuminations, and Estate Care for their continuous support. If you wish to join our Patreon community and partake in the decision making on the future content, feel free to click the link in the video description. This was WanaxTV, and we will see you again soon.